This story is titled, Sister-in-Law Called the Cops on Me, so I refused to babysit her kids. Now her life is falling apart. Hey everyone, before we dive into today's story, I want to ask for your support. We've noticed the channel losing a bit of momentum, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us out. It's free, quick, and it keeps us bringing you great content. Your support means so much. Let's keep this channel growing together. Thanks a ton. And now, let's get into this story. For years, my sister-in-law Sarah and I had a babysitting arrangement that worked seamlessly. It started back in March 2020 when the pandemic upended everything. She watched my kids 3 days a week, and I watched hers for 3 days. No money exchanged hands, no issues arose. It was a win-win. For 3 solid years, everything ran like clockwork. If something came up, we'd give each other plenty of notice, like responsible adults. Then Sarah decided to throw it all away over one ridiculous argument. A couple of weeks ago, we had a petty disagreement, so minor I can't even remember what it was about. It was that trivial, but apparently Sarah took it to heart. I figured she'd cool down after a day, so I didn't dwell on it. The next morning, I dropped my kids off at her house. As usual, I didn't go inside, and that wasn't unusual for us. If one of us was busy or just not in the mood for socializing, we'd let the kids go inside and drive off. I saw the door open, waved, and drove off to work, assuming everything was fine. My commute takes about 40 minutes, so I zoned out to music, completely unaware of the chaos brewing. When I arrived at work and checked my phone, my stomach dropped. I had 20 missed calls and a flood of texts, all from Sarah. The text started with her saying she wasn't watching my kids that day because of our argument. Then they escalated into accusing me of ignoring her messages. The final messages were threats. If I didn't pick up my kids within 45 minutes, she was calling the cops. I couldn't believe what I was reading. I called her immediately, apologizing for not seeing her messages sooner. I explained that my phone was on silent while I was driving because I don't text and drive. I promised to leave work early to pick up my kids, but she interrupted me. "You've got 45 minutes, or I'm calling the cops," she said smugly, like she thought she was doing me a favor. I was stunned. Who calls the cops on their own family? I work with kids for a living. Anything related to child abandonment on my record could ruin my career. Sarah knew this, yet she still pulled this stunt. I told her I'd leave as soon as I could, but I had a few things to finish at work. My boss was understanding, but even with her support, I couldn't leave instantly. By the time I got to Sarah's house, it had been just over an hour. When I arrived, I was greeted by 2 squad cars parked outside, lights flashing. My kids were on the porch, looking terrified. I felt like I was going to throw up. Sarah stood there chatting with the officers, acting like the victim and looking all self-righteous. I took a deep breath, got out of my car, and walked toward them. My first instinct was to yell at Sarah in front of everyone, but I knew I couldn't do that. Instead, I addressed the cops and tried to explain. "This is all a misunderstanding," I said. "I didn't abandon my kids. I dropped them off here, like I've done many times before. I didn't see her messages until I was already at work." One officer looked at me skeptically. "You didn't see her messages?" "No," I said calmly. "I was driving and my phone was on silent. As soon as I saw the texts, I called her and told her I was on my way. I got here as fast as I could." Sarah jumped in immediately. "I told you I couldn't watch them today," she snapped. "You should have checked your phone before leaving them here. This is your fault." My blood was boiling, but I kept my composure. "I didn't see your texts, Sarah. That's not an excuse to call the police on me. You know I work with kids. Do you have any idea what this could have done to me?" She shrugged, completely indifferent, as if it wasn't a big deal. The officers exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the family drama. Finally, one of them said, "This seems like a communication issue. There's no crime here, so we're not filing a report. Just make sure this doesn't happen again." They left and I grabbed my kids. Without looking at Sarah, I walked back to my car. But of course, she couldn't resist getting the last word. "Maybe next time you'll check your phone," she yelled. "This is on you, not me." I didn't respond. I couldn't. If I said anything, it would have been a string of words that would have made me look unhinged. Instead, I slammed the car door, drove home, and spent the rest of the day trying to calm down. For the next few days, I replayed everything in my head. The cops, Sarah's smug expression, my kids looking so scared. The fact that I even had to explain myself to the police made my blood boil all over again. Sarah knew exactly what she was doing and how much was at stake for me, yet she went ahead with it anyway. Then, a few days later, Sarah texted me. She had the audacity to say, "I think I might have overreacted. Can we go back to the old babysitting schedule?" I stared at her message for 5 minutes, debating whether to respond or block her entirely. In the end, I decided she needed to know exactly how I felt. "No, Sarah," I replied. "We're not going back to anything. You called the cops on me, on your own family. You knew what that could have done to me, and you didn't care. So no, I'm not babysitting your kids ever again." When I confronted Sarah about her actions, she immediately tried to shift the blame back onto me. "Figure it out," she replied almost instantly, as if she had rehearsed her response. "If you'd checked your phone or spoken to me when you dropped them off, none of this would have happened," she wrote. "I warned you." She then added, "I would have handled it differently if I were in your position." I couldn't believe her nerve. "You're out of your mind if you think this is my fault," I fired back. "You crossed a line, and I'm done with you." Sarah continued texting, trying to guilt me into forgiving her, but I refused to engage. I blocked her number, assuming that would be the end of it. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. A few days later, my brother Mike called. Normally, Mike is a laid-back guy, but when it comes to Sarah, he's completely under her thumb. The call started calmly, with him saying he just wanted to talk, but it quickly turned into him shouting at me. "Why can't you just let this go?" he demanded. Sarah apologized. She knows she went too far. "We're family. Are you seriously going to let one mistake ruin everything?" "Mistake?" I snapped back. "Mike, she called the cops on me. Do you even understand what could have happened if the police hadn't believed me? My career would have been over. She knew that and didn't care." "She was pissed," he replied, as if that justified her actions. You're really going to hold a grudge over this? You're screwing us over. Sarah had to quit her job because we can't afford childcare now. Do you even care about what this is doing to us?" "Not my problem," I said bluntly. "You and Sarah made your bed. Now lie in it." Mike exploded, calling me selfish and accusing me of tearing the family apart. I told him to back off and hung up. Moments later, my mom called, and I knew I was about to endure another round of guilt tripping. Sure enough, she started with, "You're being unreasonable. Sarah apologized. Why can't you just forgive her?" "Because this isn't about an apology, Mom," I said, trying to stay calm. "She didn't just mess up. She risked my entire career. And now you're trying to make me feel guilty because she's dealing with the consequences of her own actions. I'm done." "Of course, Mom didn't get it. You're being childish," she said. "You need to think about how this is affecting the family." I am thinking about the family, I replied. My family, my kids, myself, not Sarah and Mike. And with that, I ended the call. As bad as it was when Sarah called the cops on me and Mike bombarded me with guilt, the fallout was about to ripple through the family in ways no one had anticipated. I thought the worst was over, but I underestimated how selfish and entitled those two could be. The breaking point came when my mom started bearing the brunt of their irresponsibility, both emotionally and financially. After Sarah quit her job, she began dumping her kids on my mom, who apparently decided it was her duty to pick up the slack. At first, I didn't care. Mom had been defending Sarah, insisting I was overreacting, so I figured she'd learn her lesson once Sarah inevitably took advantage of her. It didn't take long for the cracks to show. Every time I saw my mom, she looked more and more worn out. She would complain about being tired, but never outright admit she was overwhelmed. She was clearly struggling to manage babysitting Sarah's kids 3 days a week, but she refused to say anything. Then one day, I got a call at work. It was my mom, and she sounded short of breath. She said she wasn't feeling well. My stomach sank. I told her to stay where she was and rushed over. When I arrived, she was sitting on the couch, pale and weak, struggling to stay upright. I asked what was wrong, and she said her chest felt tight, and she had a persistent headache. I wasn't about to take any risks, so I took her to the doctor. Her blood pressure was dangerously high. The doctor warned her to rest and avoid stress. Of course, I knew exactly what was causing her stress: Sarah and her kids. But even after hearing this, Mom refused to hold Sarah accountable. "They're my grandkids," she said when I brought it up. "I can't just stop helping." "Helping is one thing," I said, keeping my tone measured. "Letting them walk all over you is another. Their kids are Sarah and Mike's responsibility, not yours." She sighed and said nothing. It was clear she wasn't ready to confront them, but I was. The next time Sarah came by to drop off her kids, I happened to be at my mom's house. I hadn't planned to be there, but I had stopped by to check on her. Sarah arrived, all smiles, pretending she wasn't burdening a sick woman. "Hi, Mom," she chirped, ushering her kids inside. "I'll be back around 6. Before my mom could say anything, I stepped in. "Actually, no, you won't," I said, crossing my arms. Sarah froze, her expression shifting to confusion and then defensiveness. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you're not leaving your kids here anymore," I replied firmly. "I mean, you're not leaving your kids here anymore," I replied firmly. Her face turned red. "I'm not sitting around doing nothing," she snapped. "I'm managing things at home while Mike works. Do you know how hard it is to juggle everything?" "Yeah, I do," I shot back. "And guess what? It's your responsibility, not Mom's. Not mine, yours. Figure it out." My mom tried to defuse the situation. "Ashley, that's enough. We can talk about this later." "No, Mom," I said firmly. "We can't. You've been bending over backward for them, and look where it's gotten you. At the doctor's office. This has to stop." Sarah was livid. "You don't get to decide that," she hissed. "This is between me and Mom." Like hell it is, I said. You're putting her health at risk because you and Mike can't handle your own mess. This ends now. Fuming, Sarah stormed out with her kids, muttering under her breath about how I was ruining everything. For a moment, I thought the confrontation might be the wake-up call Sarah needed, but I was wrong. The very next week, she dropped her kids off at my mom's house again, acting like nothing had happened. Later that day, my mom called me, apologizing. "I just don't know how to say no to her," she admitted. "She always makes me feel guilty." "You have to stop letting her manipulate you," I said, trying to stay calm. "She's not going to stop until you stand up to her." "I know," Mom said quietly. "But what about the kids? They didn't ask for any of this." "They're not your responsibility," I reminded her. "You can love them without letting their mom take advantage of you." The final straw came a week later when my mom ended up in the hospital again. Her blood pressure had spiked dangerously, and this time the doctor warned that she risked having a stroke if she didn't make serious changes. Seeing her hooked up to monitors, looking so frail, broke something in me. When Mike arrived to pick up Sarah's kids, I couldn't hold back any longer. I confronted Mike directly in the hospital. "You and Sarah are killing Mom," I said bluntly. "If you leave your kids with her again, I swear I'll call the cops myself." "Don't be ridiculous," he replied, rolling his eyes. "She loves watching them. She wants to help." "No, Mike," I snapped. "She's too kind to say no, and you're exploiting that. You're putting her health at risk because you and Sarah can't figure out how to take care of your own kids." Mike didn't take kindly to that. He started yelling, accusing me of being overdramatic and making things harder for everyone. I told him I didn't care. If they couldn't handle their lives, that was on them, not me, and certainly not Mom. Later that evening, I sat down with Mom and told her it was time to put an end to the babysitting. "I love you, Mom, but this has to stop," I said. "You've done more than enough. You need to take care of yourself now." Mom cried, of course. She hated feeling like she was letting anyone down, even people who didn't deserve her generosity. But I think her second hospital visit finally drove the point home. She agreed to tell Sarah and Mike that she couldn't babysit their kids anymore. I knew it wouldn't go over well with them, but I didn't care. It was time for them to take responsibility for their own lives, whether they liked it or not. You'd think Sarah and Mike would have learned their lesson after Mom's health scare, but no. When she told them she couldn't babysit anymore, they acted like she'd betrayed them. Sarah broke down crying, complaining about how hard it was to manage everything, and insisted that Mom had promised to help. Mike, as usual, went the passive-aggressive route. He called me, furious, and tried to pin everything on me. "You happy now?" he snarled. "Mom won't help anymore because you had to get involved." "Yes, I am happy," I shot back, "because now she won't end up in the hospital again because of you and Sarah's nonsense." "She wants to help," he yelled. "You're making this harder for everyone." "No, Mike," I said. "You and Sarah are making it harder for everyone. You're both lazy and expect everyone else to pick up the slack. Mom almost had a stroke because of you two, and you're still acting like the victims. Grow up." Mike hung up on me, but I didn't care. I was done trying to reason with him. If he and Sarah wanted to keep digging themselves into a hole, that was their problem, not mine. A few days later, I got a nervous call from Mom. "Ashley, Sarah dropped the kids off again?" she said, her voice shaking. I saw red. "What? Mom, you told her you couldn't do it anymore." "I did," she said quietly. But she just left them here and said she'd be back later." That was the final straw. I called Sarah, and when she predictably didn't answer, I left her a voicemail. "You've got 45 minutes to pick up your kids, or I'm calling the cops. And unlike you, I'm not bluffing." Get your act together." I was shaking with anger when I hung up, but it felt good to give her a taste of her own medicine. About 30 minutes later, Sarah showed up, storming into my mom's house, yelling about how unreasonable I was being. "You're taking this way too far," she screamed. "Try me," I said, leaning against the counter with my arms crossed. "You had no problem calling the cops on me, so why shouldn't I do the same to you?" She kept ranting about how I was blowing things out of proportion, but I didn't engage. I just stared at her until she grabbed her kids and left. Mom looked horrified, but I didn't feel guilty in the slightest. Someone had to stand up to Sarah, and if Mom couldn't do it, I would. Of course, Mike called me later that night to chew me out. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he yelled. "You're really threatening to call the cops on us now? You're taking this way too far." "Oh, so now it's a problem when someone threatens to call the cops?" I shot back. "Maybe you should have thought about that when Sarah did it to me." "She was upset," Mike protested. "She didn't mean it like that." "Well, now I'm upset and I do mean it," I said. "You two are a disaster, and I'm not letting you drag Mom or me down with you. Figure your lives out." "You're tearing this family apart," he shouted. "No, Mike, you and Sarah are doing that all on your own," I replied, and hung up before he could say anything else. The next week, Sarah tried her usual routine, dropping the kids off at Mom's house without asking. But this time, I didn't bother calling her. I went straight to the police non-emergency line and reported the situation, explaining the two children had been left with a sick, elderly woman who couldn't care for them. When the officer arrived, Sarah was furious. She stormed into Mom's house, yelling about how I was ruining her life. "This is your fault?" she screamed. "You're destroying my family." "No, Sarah," I said calmly. "You're destroying your own family. You've been dumping your responsibilities on everyone else, and now it's catching up to you." The officers made her take her kids and warned her not to leave them with someone unable to care for them. The look on her face was priceless. She wanted to argue, but even she wasn't dumb enough to push it further. After that, Sarah and Mike stopped involving Mom in their mess, but the fallout had already begun. Sarah was struggling to manage the kids full-time, and Mike was working overtime to compensate for her lost income. Their marriage was clearly under strain. Mike even started crashing at Mom's house a few nights a week, which only made things more awkward. Mom was upset, of course. She hated seeing the family fall apart, but I reminded her that it wasn't her fault. "They're reaping what they've sown," I told her. "This isn't your problem to fix." She nodded, but I could see she still felt conflicted. That's the thing about Mom. She's too kind for her own good. Even so, she was starting to realize that Sarah and Mike were beyond saving. After the police visit, Sarah and Mike finally got the message and stopped dumping their kids on Mom, but the damage was already done. Sarah was stuck at home, trying to juggle the kids full-time, and let's just say she wasn't handling it well. Mike was working constantly to cover their bills, and the cracks in his marriage to Sarah were widening by the day. It wasn't a shock when my mom told me Mike had started spending some nights at her house. Apparently, he needed a break from Sarah because their endless arguments were driving him crazy. My mom tried to act like it wasn't a big deal, but I could see she was worried. She kept saying things like, "I just want everyone to get along," and "family shouldn't be like this." I love my mom, but I couldn't help rolling my eyes. "Mom, this isn't about getting along. Sarah and Mike made their choices, and now they're dealing with the consequences. This isn't on us." "But Ashley," she said, her voice trembling, "what if they can't make it work? What if this breaks their family?" I sighed. If their family falls apart, it's because they refuse to take responsibility for their lives. You can't keep trying to fix everything for them." Meanwhile, Sarah was telling her side of the story to anyone willing to listen. According to her, I was the heartless villain who refused to help my family during a tough time. Conveniently, she left out the part where she had called the cops on me. Instead, she framed herself as a struggling mother doing her best while I selfishly abandoned them. Soon, I started getting calls from extended family members, parroting Sarah's narrative. "Why can't you just help them out?" one aunt asked. "It's not like you're doing anything wrong, but you're making their lives so much harder." "Oh, I'm making their lives harder?" I shot back. "Did Sarah tell you she called the cops on me? Because that's why we're here." The silence on the other end of the line was always satisfying. I wasn't about to let her twist the story and make me look like the bad guy. The drama hit a peak about a month later when Mike showed up at my mom's house in the middle of the night. He was completely drunk and ranting about how he couldn't take it anymore. And yes, before you ask, I had already warned my mom not to let him stay there, but she's too kind-hearted to turn him away. When I found out the next morning, I called Mike, ready to lay into him. "What the hell is wrong with you, Mike? Showing up at Mom's house like that? She doesn't need this." "You don't understand," he slurred, clearly still hungover. "Sarah's driving me crazy. She's always complaining about how hard things are, and I'm the one busting my ass to keep us afloat." "Well, maybe if you two got your act together, you wouldn't be in this mess," I snapped. "But hey, keep blaming everyone else. That seems to be working great for you." He started yelling, but I hung up before he could finish. I wasn't wasting any more energy on him. The final straw came a few weeks later when Sarah officially quit her job for good. She had been holding on to a part-time position, but between the cost of childcare and her inability to handle the kids on her own, she gave up. Mike, in the meantime, picked up even more hours at work, but it wasn't enough. Their bills were piling up, and if they had any savings, it was gone. My mom told me they were considering moving back in with Sarah's parents several hours away. "They don't have many options left," she said, sounding genuinely sad. "Good," I said bluntly. "Maybe they'll figure out how to handle their lives without dragging everyone else down with them." She didn't respond, but I could see she was still holding on to some hope that things might turn around. I didn't share her optimism. People like Sarah and Mike don't change unless they're forced to, and even then, it's a long shot. A few weeks later, Mike called me. His tone was curt and to the point. "We're moving," he said. "Thanks for nothing." I couldn't help but laugh. "You're welcome," I replied, and hung up. As of now, Sarah and Mike are out of the picture. They moved back in with Sarah's parents, and from what I've heard, their marriage is hanging by a thread. I'd be lying if I said I felt bad for them. They brought this on themselves, and I'm not losing any sleep over it. My mom is doing much better now that she's no longer babysitting or dealing with their drama. She still talks about how sad it is that the family fell apart, but I remind her that it's not our job to fix people who don't want to fix themselves. As for me, I've made my peace with the situation. I don't think my relationship with Mike and Sarah will ever recover, but honestly, I'm okay with that. Some people need to hit rock bottom before they learn anything, and even then, they might not change. At the end of the day, I have my own family to take care of, and that's where my focus is. If Sarah and Mike want to keep playing the victim, they can do it without me. I'm done.